Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery. All these bins that you see here as well as this bag, these are all systems in which I'm doing worm composting. And I've got a couple systems that I'd like to check in on today. They're the ones that you see up here on the upper left. I arrange my bins in sort of a squiggly pattern. So what starts up here on the upper left is my oldest two bins. We're now in the middle of April and these two bins began at the start of December, at the end of December, so they're somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4 months old. A little bit shy of 4 months old, and, a little bit over 4 months old. They're 138 and 116 days of age. And it was a week ago that we last checked in on these systems. At that time, I had fed both systems, but with the older one, I had sort of tentatively decided that it was maybe time to transition out of the everyday composting stage and allow the bin to do what I refer to as foraging, which means to just deny it of any food so that the worms can really focus on breaking down any residual bits of food, bits of bedding that might still be in there. So I'm going to get these two systems out onto the bench. The game plan was to add food to the system here, the one that I'm still actively composting in. And as far as the one that's currently in this process of foraging, I wanted to see if it's possible to maybe even transition straight into the migration phase. So I generally like to go from composting to foraging to migrating the worms. We could talk more about it once we get these systems out on the bench. So let's get started. Alright, this is the younger of the two bins. This is the one that's 116 days of age. And we did notice in the other one, the older of the bins, that there was a lot of flying insects. And the one thing I noticed here was a couple of flying insects taking off when I grabbed the bin. And I can see a couple walking around. So I might have to start taking this whole flying insect matter a little bit more seriously before it becomes plague proportions. And after a week's worth of having no plastic coverings on this bin, it does seem like the top surface has dried out considerably. And that was exactly what I was after. I've got to say, I'm kind of on my guard right now because in one of my other bins, the oldest of my red wiggler bins that I was trying to prepare for harvest, I had sort of a mass die out. And I had to just trash the entire bin. I lost the entire population. And when I open up a bin like this and I see an unhealthy looking worm that's kind of, it's dead clearly, but it's also not just dead, but it looks like it's sort of falling apart. I don't think I'm being overreactive or anything like that by being on my guard. I think it is a good idea to be vigilant. If something's going on in one of your bins, it's quite possible that it could spill into other systems as well. And I just don't want to have some sort of a cascading effect going from one bin to the next, causing big problems. And what I had in that other system was sort of a mass die out. And here too, I'm seeing little chunks of dead worm here and there. I certainly hope I'm not in for a repeat of what occurred in my other red wiggler system. In that system, the material got really muddy and clumpy, and I don't know if it was like a lack of oxygen or an imbalance to the pH or what it was. I got a lot of really good feedback from lots of people after I posted a video showing those poor worms in that system and what had happened to them. And I really don't want to have the same thing occur in any of my other systems. But I've got to tell you, this is starting to show signs of maybe experiencing a similar sort of a situation. Things just don't look quite right here. I don't know, the material seems like it should be a bit more flaky. The worms, I definitely see signs of, worms that don't look well. I do feel like I also smell a little bit of that that smell of dead worms rotting. And this wasn't even the bin that I had planned on driving towards migration. This is just a bin that's in the process of composting. And the whole idea here was just to come in here with some food and feed it. And I was trying to keep in mind something one of my viewers had mentioned, which was to not come down here with food and a sort of a predisposition towards just getting rid of some kitchen scraps, but rather doing a quick inspection of the state of the bin before bringing the food down. So I came down here empty-handed, only with the camera, and the idea was to size up the need before coming down here with the materials needed to satisfy the need. I'm starting to wonder if the need here is something other than a feeding. I'm sure that the drying of this material might be helping a little bit, because as I touch chunks of it, it does crumble apart a little bit more readily than what I experienced in that bin that had that mass die out. In that other bin, it just seemed like the material was just so hard and clumpy, like chunks of clay. The worms couldn't even come and go through the stuff. Here, the material seems a little bit more manageable. It does seem to crumble apart a little bit more readily as I move it around. I'm assuming that the past week's worth of drying of the material has helped a lot too. I've received so many comments providing all kinds of excellent feedback on different things that I could have done in that other bin to potentially turn things around and prevent catastrophe. And I really don't want to disappoint either the viewers or myself, and most importantly these poor worms, by not taking the right next steps here. I'm debating on what to do next here, you know. I mean, I was preparing just to feed, but I'm starting to become suspicious about this material. If in fact there's some sort of a bacteria going amok in here that doesn't really belong. One person suggested that the reason things could suddenly become really clay-like and hard is because that bacteria just sucks up all the moisture in the bin. Next thing you know, you've got material that the worms can't even hardly move through. So I was kind of on the lookout for signs of that. People have talked about pH, but I don't even really know if I've got a good way to test for pH. And I don't have any sort of test strips or any sort of chemical testing stuff. I think like if you had maybe a pool water testing kit, you could test for pH. I think I've also heard of different testing methods you could use just with household materials. I think stuff like vinegar. So if you take like a vinegar or something like that, a more acidic type household product, like just your everyday vinegar, and mix it with the material that's in your bin. If you see some sort of a reaction between the two, it might tell you that the material in the bin is too alkaline or basic. And I think going the other direction, you could take something like sodium carbonate or baking soda or something like that, baking powder. And if you combine that with your material, since that material is more basic and, you know, the opposite of acidic, it's if that's mixed with your material and it provides a similar sort of reactive bubbling or something, I forget what it was, but I did once look into whether I might have the things that would be needed to do a test like that around the house, and I know I do. Then it might be possible to determine if there's sort of a pH imbalance going on. And you know, if I suddenly decided I wanted to try to combat insects in here, like the flying bugs, and I put a lot of something that would, you know, try to reduce the acidity even further or potentially push it into a more alkaline state, then that could almost become even more dangerous to the worms than if it had been getting a little bit overly acidic. So I'm definitely not going to do anything with trying to adjust the pH. I think, you know, if I were to try even using diatomaceous earth as a way to try to combat the flying insects, I think that too has sort of a pH effect by reducing acidity. Chemistry is not my language, so I'm not sure if I'm expressing all these things correctly, but, you know, I'm a little bit paranoid. I might be on edge just based on what I experienced a few days ago in my other system, where things really turned bad quick. And it almost makes me feel like I'd like to try to get the worms the heck out of this material, not knowing if I've got the ability or the means to turn it around. One thing people did suggest was just maybe using something like COCO or some other sort of carbon-based material to see if that might help not only draw in some of the moisture, but also potentially help counteract maybe an overly nitrogen-rich environment, which could result from just, you know, non-stop feeding and insufficient application of bedding. Here again, I feel like I'm at a little bit of a loss. I feel like I was better prepared for this form of troubleshooting. And you would think after what I went through in my most recently completed, if you want to call it that, bin, where it didn't really complete in a graceful way. It just got completed by the worms dying out and me dumping the material. I'm just tempted to just push the entire contents of this material to one side and create a nice big huge fresh leaves, fresh paper, a little bit of food in there, nice damp fresh conditions, a place for the worms to be able to move out to if in fact what's going on in here is causing them any sort of distress or discomfort. One of the warning signs I observed in that other bin that went south really quick was that for a number of days prior to the mass die-off, the worms were just cruising the surface. And I believe that that probably could have been a sign to me that there was something going wrong in there. The worms were just trying to get out of the material. So I'm gonna set this aside briefly, because if both systems need the same treatment, I don't want to just deal with it here and then have to deal with it there too. I'm gonna do an assessment of the other of my two older red wiggler bins too, to see what the deal is in there, and if we're gonna take the same course of action in both of them, I'll be able to just better prepare for both of them at once. So let's move this one off to the side. I'm just going to temporarily cover it back up with some of the things that were within the bin, but I'm not going to put it away as if it's not going to be dealt with any further today, because I think we will be back in here, and I'm not sure if it's going to just be your everyday feeding. It might be the feeding that's geared up for trying to migrate the worms out of the material. So let's go check out the older of the two bins and see what's going on in there. All right, so now something that another of my viewers mentioned, which kind of stuck in my head, was the idea of transferring bad materials or bad something from one bin to the other. So I've done a quick rinse of my glove, and I guess what I'm trying to avoid is, if in fact there is some sort of a weird bacterial thing going on here, I wouldn't want to be transferring stuff from one bin to the other. Here too, I'm still seeing a good amount of these stupid flying insects. So I'm just going to fold this in half and give the whole thing a little squash and try to knock out those bugs. Jeez Louise. And I'm assuming that we're probably going to have a number of them in here still besides what was on the paper. Just going to knock them out when I see them. I had laid in this diatomaceous earth around the edges, thinking that if the bugs are going to come and go, they might land in the diatomaceous earth and that it would knock them out. But I guess the big problem with that was that it was being placed right on top of damp material, which pretty much negates the effect of the diatomaceous earth. So now this is eerily reminiscent of the bin that died out on me, the way the material is getting kind of hard and clumpy, and my only hope is that it's only because I was not covering with plastic and that just the stuff on the surface is like this. My hope is that we could stir this stuff up a little bit and kind of equalize the moisture, but find somewhat more crumbly material down deeper. And I keep thinking about what that one person said in the comments, is how that one type of bad bacteria can just come in and suck up all the moisture, and what you're left with is just some really nasty clay-like material. I really don't like the appearance of this material, you know. I mean, it doesn't look anything like it should. I just recently harvested a couple African nightcrawler systems, and the material was just so perfect in those systems. It was just crumbly and loose. I was able to just sift all the contents of the material and screen it out, and I ended up with some really nice material. I guess the only gotcha with that stuff was that I believe it was pretty heavily populated with mites. Here we've got ourselves a really large size worm. This is the bin in which I believe there's a mix of a few different types of worms. Luckily, I don't have that weird odor. I don't sense that stinkiness of death, of dead worms. But what's kind of unusual to me is that I'm hardly seeing any worms. I'm wondering where the heck they could be. I mean, the last bin that we checked in on, I think that according to my records, my estimate for the number of worms in that system is about 1,000, but my estimate for how many worms populate this system is twice that. Here too. When a worm is really thick like this, some people, here again, I'm just repeating stuff that people tell me in my comments, so I'm no expert on this stuff, but some people have talked about how if the worm is really thick and short, it's, you know, constricting its body because it's uncomfortable or something like that. So more recently, every time I see a worm like that, it seems like not just a novelty or an unusual thing to see, but rather something that I'm more recently perceiving as a potential warning sign. I just wish the material would be a little bit more crumbly. And I guess what I wish even more is that I'd be able to see more worms. It just feels like there's so few worms in here. I don't have any reason to think that they would have... Oh, okay. I thought I just caught a glimpse of a big worm ball down here, so I suppose there's that possibility that they're just hanging out by the food. Because I don't think we've really gotten to the food that we put in here last week yet. The food was placed down the middle, so let's just keep excavating to get a glimpse of how things are looking down where the food was. I guess it is realistic to think that maybe the worms are just hanging out down by the food. Except I'm not seeing any on this side. That seems very unusual too. The food items I put in here were just, you know, your typical kitchen scraps, small little chunks of carrot peels and chopped up veggies and stuff like that. But I thought I saw something over here. Let's see if we can get to that point. So here we're finally starting to see signs of life. It almost seems like the worms are all kind of hanging out together. And here again, a knee-jerk reaction to that might be, hey, they must have really found a delicious chunk of food. But I'm trying to keep my mind open to interpreting these signs a little differently and not get too single-minded on what's causing what. I'm kind of wondering if maybe they're just jumbling together because, you know, being huddled up against one another is a lot more comfortable than being just out and about within this material. And that certainly seems like a very plausible explanation too. I mean, granted, I don't see any signs of the food. that I placed in here a week ago. I mean, yeah, okay, maybe I'm being a little bit overgeneralized in what I'm saying there, but you know, here's, for example, a piece of asparagus, which typically gets hollowed out pretty readily, and then the outer tougher shell part of it, or outer skin of the vegetable, takes a little longer for the worms to break down. But I'm not so convinced that the reason all these worms were huddled together was because of some sort of a delicious morsel of food that had been there. I'd rather just kind of be a little bit more cautious in my thinking at this point and not skim over potential warning signs. And I'm definitely gravitating towards that theory of maybe their reason for huddling together is because of the fact that maybe they don't feel comfortable within this material, and that just being up against one another is more comfortable for them. Let's just get to the end of this bin and see what things look like on this far edge. I hate the idea of taking an approach which attempts to recover from this and then end up regretting it because maybe that attempt fails, and then what I end up with is just another tub of dead worms. I'm definitely gravitating more towards the thinking that it might be best just to try to provide these worms with an escape route and just initiate a migration of the worms out of the material. You know, set them up with a nice fresh environment on one edge of the bin, all fresh bedding, all fresh food. And then if this stuff is in fact causing them discomfort, then they've got a safe haven, place to retreat to get out of this stuff if this stuff is in fact tainted with either bacteria or an imbalance in pH or whatever the case may be in here. So I'm definitely gravitating towards that. And I don't know if I'm just overreacting, but it does feel like this material just isn't right, you know? There's something about this material which doesn't seem right to me. And I'm saying that about the material in both of these systems. So I might need a moment or two to set up for this. But luckily I've got a box of leaves that I bought in from outside. I've been treating the leaves that I bring in from outside by putting them in the microwave first and trying to make sure that I've sort of sterilized the material before using it in any of my worm bins. That's because I suspect that I might have bought mites in from outside on some of the leaves that I had bought in here from outside, and I just don't want to make that same mistake again if in fact that theory holds true. So I might need a few minutes to assemble a collection of leaves. I'm thinking that the material that we create into which we want them to be able to migrate should be really loose and fluffy, combination of different types of carbon-based bedding materials like leaves, maybe some paper, maybe some cardboard. Drop in some food too, you know, just to make the place you know, not only habitable but also stocked with materials to sustain them. Dampening it all down nicely to make it nice and cozy and damp for them. And then covering that with plastic too once we set it all up so it retains its moisture and doesn't end up drying out. Whereas on this other side of the bin where the material is going to remain, I could see just leaving this continuing to dry, leaving it exposed to the air, so that maybe some of this moisture gets kicked off in the process. So I'm gonna do a quick reset here. I'm gonna try to assemble the things that I think I need to do this in both of these systems. And I'm gonna just switch in this bin from composting to migration, and in the other bin too, I'm gonna be switching from what I currently consider to be a foraging stage, even though they were both fed at the same time a week ago. I don't even know if it's realistic at this point to consider that that other bin had ever even done much of anything in terms of foraging. It might just be easiest to consider these bins as sort of skipping the foraging stage in the interest of trying to just evacuate them out of the material. Material that is, I think at this point, suspect to being tainted in one way or another. So let me get myself cleaned up. I'm going to prep some materials for this, and I think we're just going to set up horizontal migration feeding zones for both of these bins, nice big ones, and hopefully we'll be able to set up environments that the worms can retreat into out of this stuff, if in fact my theory is true that this material is causing the worms discomfort. And as far as these stupid flying insects are concerned, you know, it's a nuisance, but I'm not going to let that distract me here. I think the more important and pressing situation is to try to give these worms a place to go other than the material that they're inhabiting right now. All right, I'm going to move things aside, get cleaned up, assemble the stuff I need to get this done, and we're going to get to work on it momentarily. So I went ahead and I emptied out my little box here that I've got all my leaves in. It was probably about 2/3 of the way full of leaves, but it was pretty compressed. I jammed them all in there so that when I dumped them into this little tub to try to figure out how much I've got, I realized that I think I've got enough here already. So I didn't need to go out and get more. But now, just because I'm paranoid about bringing in more mites from outside, I'm pretty sure that the way the mites made it in last time was on the leaves that I bought in from outside. This box fits pretty neatly inside of my microwave, so I placed these leaves while they were still in this box within my microwave and gave it 2 5-minute sessions on high, and the box was pretty much steaming. It was so hot, the material inside, that I'm assuming that if there was anything still alive on this stuff trying to hitchhike its way into my wormery, I've probably, hopefully, sterilized it. It's a nice way of saying I killed it, hopefully. So besides the leaves, I've got some other stuff here. Some of it's recycled. This piece of newspaper was the top covering on one of the bins, as was some of this material here, these tattered bits of paper. And I've also over here got one of the newspapers that was the top covering. I've got another one that we're going to just use similar top coverings on both, as well as plastic to cover the feeding area. I've got other pieces of paper here. I got used coffee filters, used paper towels. All of this stuff is going to serve as bedding. Top covering is going to be the white newspaper and the plastic coverings. I've also got an assortment of different foods that I'm going to include in the feeding area. It's just a whole bunch of different, the bud of lettuce, banana peels, some red cabbage, some carrot peelings, mango peelings, some chunks of cucumber in here, all kinds of different stuff. So I'll distribute this evenly between the two bins to set up the two feeding areas. And I've also got a little oddball item over here. I had prepared this for the time lapse that I've got running over in the other room. I had created ice cubes. I usually use ice cubes to apply moisture to my time lapse bins, but in this case I put a whole bunch of pulverized eggshell into the ice trays to have grit incorporated into the ice cubes that I used. So I'm going to go ahead and use these up because I created more than I needed for that segment of that time-lapse video. So we're going to include these in the building of the horizontal migration feeding zones for the sake of applying some slow time release moisture as well as a little bit of grit. And if we find that we need more moisture, I've got my spray bottle here too. So I'm going to move all this material aside and we'll get to work on the bins and try to set up a sort of a sanctuary area within these two bins that the worms can escape to. And if in fact my theory is true that the environment is turning hostile to the worms, at least they'll have a place to retreat to. All right, let's get to work on this. Shouldn't take much longer. So I brought the two systems back out here onto the bench, and I've set the camera to wide angle so we can work on these side by side at the same time. We had already nudged all the material in the older bin over to the one side, I guess, since we had already anticipated what the next steps would be. But I'm going to go ahead and do the same in here. The material in here feels a little bit more crumbly and flaky. Perhaps still a little too damp, but perhaps not in as dire shape as the older bin. I definitely feel like the older bin is feeling a little bit weirder. Although it is in this bin here that I can sense slight traces of the scent that makes me think that there's things going wrong in here. Kind of that weird stench of rotting flesh. Kind of that smell when you go into a bait shop and you know that they can't always clean up every last worm and squid and crayfish and all the different types of live bait that they use in a bait shop. You always know that there's going to be a little something going on in a place like that, and you always smell that when you go into a bait shop. I'm not much of a fisherman, but I used to fish when I was younger. Go on outings with my friends and with my dad and stuff like that, but since I don't eat fish, I don't really end up in bait shops very often. But I definitely distinctly remember that kind of putrid smell of something. I never knew what it was, but I believe it's just decaying flesh. So I've pretty much created a nice spacious area in both of these bins to set up this feeding zone, and I've not created the perforated cardboard barriers that I normally do for this sort of a situation, but still in the interest of having some sort of a partition or visual indicator to show where the dividing line is. I took the top covering that had been on the older bin, and we're going to recycle it in such a way that it serves that same sort of purpose, just as a visual aid for me to see where the finished castings are in each system versus where the horizontal migration feeding zone is. And you might notice that I'm building this feeding zone a lot larger than I typically do in most cases. I really want to create a large space that the worms can, utilize if they should all quickly move over. And luckily I've got a couple pre-built bins on standby into which I could start relocating these worms. I wouldn't want to commingle these systems or the occupants of these systems, because this system here I know has sort of a mix of various types of worms in it. So since these feeding areas are fairly large in size, I do expect to use most, if not all, of these leaves here. I'm going to see if I could kind of layer it a little bit. We'll lay down some leaves first as a foundation, and then we can start bringing in some of this recycled paper that had been covering up the systems. We'll just lay that in here too. This is all bedding as far as I'm concerned. Just a carbon-based food source, as well as a bedding type material for the worms to be able to hang out in. Now we've got some of these food items here. I guess we could start plopping them in. I usually don't like to have stuff like this too near the surface, because it could also contribute to attracting pests and stuff. And we already saw signs of various types of flying insects trying to make themselves at home here. So I don't want to promote that sort of activity in my worm bins. So we're going to submerge the food pretty low within these systems. And some of the stuff we're putting in here, like these mango peels, the banana peels, a lot of this stuff probably does have the tendency to, give off a nice tempting odor and attract pests. So we're going to do everything in our power to limit that. I mean, I'm just maybe going a little overboard on trying to distribute this stuff evenly. It's not all that important as far as I know. I still think that the main attraction here is not going to be the food itself. I think it's just going to be a space where the worms might feel a little bit more comfortable if in fact the material that they're inhabiting presently is tainted in any way. So we'll break out these 2 coffee filters next. We'll tear them open. We're going to leave them whole so they can almost serve as sort of a single layer of covering over the food that we just applied. And as this stuff starts to thaw out, it's going to emit a lot of moisture, so I think it'll pretty readily moisten all those dry leaves in the lower levels. So I think that's already kind of a situation where the moisture in the food and the dry materials combined probably makes for a pretty good balance in terms of creating a nice damp environment for the worms to be drawn into. So now I've got some paper towels here too we can start laying in. Again, I'm attempting to just cover up the food we put in here so that it doesn't suddenly become an attractant and bring in all the pests. So now on top of this, we could probably sprinkle another couple handfuls of leaves. So let's do that here. Okay, we're getting there, definitely. Now what else do we have? I'm trying to think. I got that grit covered ice, so why don't we go ahead and do away with that. It's pretty interesting. In the time-lapse container I had laid these ice cubes down with the grit on top, and as the ice melted away I was left with these little patches of grit on the top surface, and within a couple days it seems like the worms came up for that. And they nibbled away most of the grit that had been resting on the top surface within that time-lapse bin. So I don't know if they were just really desperate for grit or if they just really enjoy it that much. This is like the slightly larger system, I believe, and possibly the one that's a little bit drier too. So we'll put the additional extra spare ice cube in there. We'll just drip in whatever melted into this one. Again, my I guess attempt at trying to keep balance here. So I'm trying to think what else we have. We don't have a whole lot left here, right? We've got one more paper towel that we can drape across the top of each. And then I've also got a little bit of leafy material, but not a whole lot else. So why don't we just use what remains to finish off these feeding areas. Try to turn them into a nice tempting area that's hopefully going to be a welcome safe haven for the worms to retreat into if my theory is true about what might be going on in these bins. I've got my squirt bottle. So again, I know that there's going to be moisture coming out of the ice cubes, moisture coming out of the frozen foods, but I don't want these feeding areas to be so dry that it's not going to attract the worms, or that it'll turn any worms off that might make their way over to it and be interested in coming in and occupying it, but find that they can't because it's exceedingly dry. Now I am going to be covering up with the white paper across the top and then just the plastic over the feeding areas. This way the white paper on top will allow for ongoing drying of the possibly overly damp castings material, and the plastic covering only the feeding area will hopefully prevent excess moisture loss over here, so it stays nice and damp and cozy for the worms to come and move into. So I don't know, maybe we can even sort of cover it up a bit. I'm not sure. Let's give that a try. At this point, we're just going to start leveling things off here a little bit. All these worms very close to the surface makes me also a little bit suspicious, because I believe one of the early warning signs that I observed in that one bin that had that mass die out was that maybe a week or 2 weeks prior to the total collapse of the environment, I did notice worms cruising the top surface in that bin, and it sort of appeared to me kind of like a novelty, like an interesting thing that I even shot some time-lapse footage of, but it didn't register in my mind as a potential warning sign of trouble. So that too in itself could potentially be a sign. I'm always just talking through all these ideas in my head, because some of them could be completely wrong, but it's just food for thought, I guess, if nothing else, because I don't really know. All right. So now all that really remains is to get things here covered up, and like I said, we're bringing back one of these white papers. Was already in action here, covering up one of the 2 bins. And I had another sheet of it, pretty similar in size, exactly the same in size. And let's see, the feeding area, I'd like to try to preserve the moisture in and make it into a nice damp space where the moisture is recirculating and doesn't get lost to evaporation. So we're going to cover up here with plastic coverings in both systems. So I really don't know exactly what's going on here, and maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I'm just, I don't know, shell-shocked from the last time I encountered a serious big problem in one of my bins. So, you know, I guess at this point I might be prematurely initiating migration of the worms out of these systems, but I don't know, I've got this funny feeling what I'm doing here probably is the right thing to do. But I'm sure I'll get a lot of great ideas from the viewers, so I look forward to reading everyone's comments. Please provide me with your thoughts on what you think's happening here, and whether you think what I did here was the right next steps for these bins. I certainly hope it is, and naturally, if anybody gives me some better ideas that I can implement within these bins, then I'll be prepared to take action on any suggestions. So I look forward to reading everyone's comments. So that's it for the video. Be keeping my fingers crossed, that's for sure. Hoping for the best here, not for my sake, but more for the sake of the poor worms. I really don't want to end up with, you know, more carnage on my hands. It would be really unfortunate. So let's see what happens. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.